is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 668. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from Denver, Colorado, still in the kitchen, it's Louis Scott-Vargas. How you doing, buddy?
Good. It's getting a little chillier here, so that means I've had to, instead of just short sandals and a t-shirt, it's short sandals and a hoodie, but, it all works out.
The annual tradition. Are you a fan of sweater weather?
No, not so much. I'd prefer it to be hot rather than anything else.
Me too. It drives me nuts when people start talking about that too early. It's like mid-August and they're like, oh, the leaves are going to start falling and I can get my favorite thing at Starbucks. And I'm just like, no, just let me have this, right? I live in Seattle, right? I got to enjoy the summer while it's here. We'll have plenty of gray skies to look forward to. But yeah, you and I are on the same page. Thankfully, it's actually still nice here. We've got a bunch of stuff to cover on the show this week. We're going to be talking, of course, about Dominaria United, some of our favorite decks that we've been drafting. We've chosen 3 of them to talk about. We talked about the 5-color domain deck last week, but we're going to be talking about 3 other ones this week and a bunch of other cool stuff to cover on the show this week. Before we get into it, though, let's talk about our sponsors. First up, channelfireball.com. Make sure you check them out for all things magic related, anything you need. You can find over at CFB. They've got awesome content over there with CFB Pro as well as the CFB Marketplace, and you can find it all nice and easy. And of course, they're backed customer service wise by some of the best people in the business. Make sure you check out Channel Fireball. We're also brought to you by FTX. That's a place to manage your digital assets. This is something that people are going to find that they need more and more going forward as we keep moving forward technologically. And FTX is the best place to go to do this stuff. And, this is one of those things that I think, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we never would have even thought that we needed anything like that. And in 10 or 15 years from now, you probably won't even know what it's like to not have access to this type of stuff. It's just, we're in that weird transition time in between. And a lot of times that comes down to trust and safety and that type of thing. And that's why you should go to FTX, because they are the safe, trusted resource for this type of thing. Inside the United States, it's ftx.us, and outside is ftx.com. You can also download an app for your phone for maximum ease of use. We, of course, always want to remind you that anytime you engage with these type of products, an exchange, which is what FTX is, it's a place to go to buy and sell digital assets. You are in many ways investing. You're taking on risk. And with that, you need to educate yourself. This is true for any type of investment. You always should consult an investment professional, ask the questions, read up. And when you're ready, head on over to FTX, ftx.us within the US and ftx.com. With that, we thank them for their sponsorship. Show is also brought to you by you via the Patreon. It's patreon.com/limited resources. This is a great way to support the content creators, your favorite ones, the people that brighten your day or that help you out. This is one of the great things that's happened with the advent of the internet, and then subsequently the way that content has gone because of the internet, which is that it's much more diverse now. It's much more spread out into smaller pockets, where before it used to be that in order for something to get on the air, whether it was radio or television, it would need to appeal to the widest possible audience. Huge audiences were needed to justify putting out shows. And that kind of brought everything into the middle, which can be a little bit boring. But thanks to, again, internet and the way that things have gone, now we're all spread out. So we can have podcasts like this where we talk about a very specific topic about magic, not only just about magic, but we also talk about specifically limited magic, right? And I have a YouTube channel about fixing watches. These are things that never would have been able to be made. And Patreon and things like YouTube and Patreon are why these things are possible, is so that people can spend the time and energy needed, the commitment to it, to actually keep these things going, for the long term, rather than having it be a side project that ends up falling off. If you'd like to support us on Patreon or any of the things that you love, it's patreon.com/limited resources for us. And we do appreciate each and every person who supports us there. One of the things you get access to is a Patreon feed, which is where we put our questions. This is where we put the post for the Patreon question of the week, which we're going to ask right now. This one comes from Sam, and it says, "Hey guys, this question is for Luis. My wife and I welcomed our firstborn into the world last month." Congratulations, Sam. "It's been an absolute exhausting blast so far. Much like you, I already find myself busy juggling freelance writing, bartending, playing music, hosting home cube tournaments, the list goes on. What advice would you give for juggling parenthood with the pursuit of other endeavors, magic included? Thank you both for the years of wisdom and entertainment. Thanks, Sam. What do you think, Luis? I mean, you're very much in this same situation. You've got an extremely full plate.
Yeah, I think that the things to keep in mind is you've got the things that you absolutely have to do. And so, you do those. And then when it comes to things that you don't, it's really important to prioritize and try to figure out, like, what are the things that are more important. Don't let it kind of randomly be decided. Don't let you kind of make these decisions by default. Just try to figure out what's important to you. And part of it is keeping stuff that is important to you. Like that list of stuff that Sam puts out, like, freelance writing, bartending, playing music, cube tournaments. What of those are more important than others? Because they can't all be equally important, or at least it's pretty unlikely that that's the case. So given that, how are you going to prioritize those? Which one can maybe slide? Like one, for us is we haven't hosted Cube that much. Like that's one that just it's a bigger lift, right? So try to keep in mind the things that you can and can't live without, and then try to kind of structure things so you get at least some of the stuff that you like to do, because it's important to keep that up too.
Yeah, you don't want to let that kind of stuff slide too far, right? Because if you end up doing all things that are all responsibilities all the time, then you're kind of worse at all the things, So yeah. Keep that in mind. Yeah, and Luis is definitely the person to ask this stuff. So great question, Sam. Thanks for that. Couple of things to cover before we get into our crack-a-packs. Actually, first one up. I got a preview card, Luis, for Unfinity. Now, I want to read this card just because it's kind of funny. And, this is an unset. If you've never seen one of these before, this is where Wizards prints cards that aren't really meant to be played.
What's the name of this? This set is uninteresting. Is that what it is?
That's so brutal. This is funny. Some people like this stuff.
Yeah, I agree that some people like this stuff.
They did, by the way, throw us a nod. This is draftable. Unfinity is 100% meant to be drafted or played and sealed. And in fact, the card that I got mentions it specifically as part of the rules for it. So this is called Merry-Go-Round, which is an artifact, but it's an attraction. It doesn't have a casting cost. It's part of a sub-game that you get to play. And it has Visit. And it says, creatures you control with power 2 or less gain horsemanship until end of turn. And it does remind us that they can't be blocked except by creatures with horsemanship. Horsemanship is a old school one from Portal or something?
Yeah, Portal 3 Kingdoms actually is where that one shows up first.
Right. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it replaced or flying. Is that?
It's basically flying in the Portal context, where creatures with horsemanship can only be blocked by other creatures with horsemanship.
Right.
Which is flying, because Portal 3 Kingdoms was it was themed after a kind of Chinese history and folklore, or the Chinese epics. The Tale of the Three Kingdoms, I think, is what it's called.
Okay.
But it's a bunch of historical figures plus fantastic figures, right? And I think they decided, well, flying wouldn't make as much sense as horsemanship. There's a lot more characters riding horses, but we want the actual mechanical thing. So it's kind of funny, though, because when it leaks into other formats, horsemanship is really powerful because no one has horsemanship creatures.
Yeah, horsemanship is unblockable, effectively. And then, so you may be wondering, well, what the heck is an attraction and how does this whole thing work if I can't cast this thing? So there's a rules card that says, welcome to the Astrotorium. And it says, open an attraction. So that means, play the card that I just said, by putting the top card of this deck onto the battlefield. Destroyed attractions go to the junkyard, which I'm assuming is the graveyard. I don't know. And then it says, wonderful. And it says, roll a 6-sided die as your main phase begins. Visit each attraction with the result lit up. Fantabulous. Now, on the front of the attraction, there's a list of numbers on the side, 1 through 6, and 2 of those numbers are lit up and the other ones are dark. So You get the merry-go-round, you play it from the top of this deck, your Astrotorium or your attraction deck or whatever they call it. And then if it's out and you roll a 2 or a 6 in the case of the merry-go-round, then all your small creatures get horsemanship. But here's the cool part about the limited thing that I mentioned. It said building an attraction deck. In limited, use any you draft or open and seal deck with a bare minimum of 3. And then in constructed, you can have no more than 1 with the same name, and you can have a minimum of 10. So your attractions in constructed are a lot more spread out. But here, as long as you can hit 3 of them, you can have an attraction deck in limited and open an attraction or something. Anyway, we'll keep a not so close eye out on what Unfinity does with regards to limited. I'm always curious to see, because sometimes they use it as a testing ground or they push boundaries and do some funny stuff. And I am curious about it, but we don't treat those as our normal sets. Like we don't do, full set reviews on them or anything, because they're mostly just made to be fun. The other thing that we need to talk about, Luis, although probably won't take very long, is the showdown.
Yeah, the 10th LR versus LOL showdown was this last Monday, and after the draft portion, I felt pretty good because I had a red-green domain aggro deck, which is like mostly red-green, like an actual curve, 2 Vishino, branch riders, that sort of thing, alongside 2 Gaia's Mites, 2 Maria's Outriders. So I wasn't even really playing that many off-color cards, but I was playing all the lands in order to enable these domain payoffs. And I was like, okay, my deck's pretty good. Maybe for a team draft, around a 7 out of 10. And then BK's deck was a domain deck that didn't quite get there. So I actually got that prediction wrong. It was me and BK who drafted the not quite there domain deck.
Yeah.
His deck looked a little weaker. But then your deck was just a monster. It was straight blue-black, no mana issues. You even had 2 dual lands, one which was a grotto, so you could play off-color kickers.
Both of my duels paid off-color kickers, Louise. Both of my duels.
Oh, I thought your other one was a contaminated aquifer.
No, I had a green for the repossession, and I had a white for the kicker on the Tellurian Geyser. I mean, it was just perfect.
Gotcha. Yeah, your deck was just fantastic, and it was definitely the 4 tributes, the shield dread, like just everything you'd want. So I was like, well, going into the games, I thought we've got to be in pretty good shape here. As it turns out, Mr. Metronome had a fantastic blue-red deck. Like his blue-red spells deck was actually just perfect, like multiple lightning strikes and like just a ton of Balmor and electrostatic infantry, everything you'd want. But he had kind of bad draws against BK, and then I was able to get him 2. So he went 0-2. We started out 3-0, and Alex's deck was like a blue-green domain-ish deck that didn't quite get there, it looked like. And then Lord Tupperware's deck was red-white aggro, which looked solid, but still wasn't the most.
It looked like a team draft version of.
Yeah, it looked like more like a team draft aggro deck. Yeah. Is a good way to put it. So at the end of the day, we ended up going 5-1 against them in the first 2 rounds. Then just me and Alex played out the last round. Yeah,
so it was a proper thumping. I had an interesting ride for the draft portion of it, in that I was joking with my chat about opening the best card in the set, and then I did. And that was Shieldred. So I opened that, took it, obviously, and then, felt pretty incentivized to try to be in black. The next card I took was Tribute. So, that doesn't make you black-blue, but it leans you there a little bit. The kicker on that's an important thing to be able to do. Tribute's playable without it, but it's actually just really good if you can kick it as well. And so I settled into blue-black fairly quickly, and it dried up almost right away, especially the black, which really had me worried because I wanted to play the Shieldred. And so I was like, okay, but this is team draft. Like it usually doesn't go smoothly, right? Everybody's taking everything. Everybody in the pod knows what they're doing. So fair enough. But then I thought, but in the second pack, I could get really hooked up. And then I didn't. I actually had a disastrous second pack, and I was doing the whole, with a few picks left, I was like, is this a playable? Hey, there's a librarian or whatever, clockwork librarian or automatic librarian. Oh yeah, give me that guy. Right. And I was starting to get a little hot under the collar about it because I was genuinely worried that I would be short playables. And then the third pack was just absurd for me. It was just one of those things where everything that I wanted to wheeled, and I opened everything good. And the deck just went from having some really nice highlights with a bunch of filler to just being like a 9, or maybe even higher for a team draft.
That was basically a 10
it
for
was
a team
pretty
draft.
much, right? I mean, it just had everything.
I mean, I am shocked Mr. Mesham went 0-2. I think he got pretty unlucky to go 0-2 because both you and his decks were just about as good as it gets for a team draft. Even for a normal draft, it would have been quite good. So, but as it turns out, you did not get unlucky in your draws. You just rattled off 2 quick wins.
Well, my draws were really good too. Like look, the deck sees a lot of cards, so there's something to that. But I mean, I saw Shieldred all the time, and I had one game, where I had against Alex, where I had Shieldred in my hand, and I also had Shore Up, and I also had Urborg Repossession.
Yeah,
and I'm just like, I basically have 3 Shieldreds in my hand. And it interestingly did actually take all 3 of them. Like Alex worked his way through he killed my Shieldred twice basically, and then I bought it back and played it the 3rd time, and it was like, okay, fine. But anyway, yeah, so that was nice. So what does that bring us to as far as the records go?
We're up 7-3 after 10 showdowns.
7-3.
Though it's funny, we've been the beneficiary of good win spacing, as it were, because our match count is a lot closer. We were 41-40 in matches going into this, though.
I'm kind of not buying that anymore. Like, what was our match count from Monday?
Well, we went 6-1, so now we're 47-41. But that's still not.
But we should be higher.
Match lead. Why? We went 6-1.
We counted yours, but I mean, I could have played and won the last round. We just took mercy on them and left.
Well, yeah,
if once you win, you should get all the wins leading up to the 9 automatically. Once you lock it in.
I think there's only been a couple drafts where we had the 2-round victory though.
Okay, if that's true, I felt like there's been more. I felt like when we've won, it's been landslidey. Although the one prior we were 3-0 and then 1-2, so like that made it a lot more interesting. No, I mentioned this to my chat at the beginning too. Even though I think that 41-40 is a little misleading, it is generally true. We could easily be flipped, and it could be 7-3 for them. That is 100% the truth. Every single time we play, it feels like it's going to be really close. Sometimes it ends up not being, but usually it is. Okay, so let's get into the Cracker Packs here. I want to do a couple of these, Luis. Again, I think early in the format, it's really important to let us kind of talk about how we approach these packs. So the first pack up, our first card is Eerie Soul Tender. That's the 2 and a black 3/1, and you can spend some mana and exile it to get a card back. And when it ETBs, you mill 3, which is actually kind of annoying.
Yeah, it's a solid card. I mean, yeah, like if you end up playing it, you're usually pretty happy. Like it can trade off well enough, and then you end up in a spot where you get an extra card in the late game, and this format does lend itself to that.
It's funny because this is very, very much a format of 2-for-1s, right? Like they are rampant in this format, and this is one of the slower ones, but it definitely counts. Broken Wings. Tunergy, instant destroy an artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. I've been playing primarily best of 1, and when you see a Broken Wings, it usually feels like a crime's been committed against you, but you don't see them very often.
No, I think the card is an okay sideboard card. I would not main deck it, though, which means if you're playing in best of 1, you don't really have a reason to interact with it too often.
Right. Take Up the Shield. This has become one of the premier combat tricks, and it sees heavy play. This is the 1 and a white instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It gains lifelink and indestructible until end of the turn. Really nice little combination of things there, right? Protecting it. The lifelink's a nice swing, and then the +1/+1 counter allows it to win combat.
Yeah, no, Take Up the Shield is great. It does exactly what you want to do in a bunch of different scenarios. So yeah, a card I'm always happy to play.
Yeah, it's interesting because, they'll often mix together things like, I'll give a little of this, a little of that, a little of this. This is a particularly good combo. Charismatic Vanguard. This is the 2 and a white 3/2. And you can pay 4 and a white to give creatures you control +1/+1. I actually saw this guy a little more often earlier in the format, and I don't see him now, and I don't tend to play him. In fact, one of the decks we're going to talk about today is Black-White, which often has like a token or go wide sub-theme attached to it. And it's funny because I was making a list of cards that could take advantage of that, and I didn't even put this on the list. Is that an oversight by me?
No, I'm not a huge fan.
I'm not either. Shore Up is next. It's blue instant target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains hexproof, and you untap it. Definitely
this played
solid.
pretty well too.
Yeah. Again, for the price, right? Also, the fact that there are oftentimes creatures worth protecting, and on top of that, the fact that Shore Up's so cheap, it actually allows you to get the creature down first and still have the Shore Up available. I mentioned that with cards like Shieldred, which is, an exceptional case. But I mean, there's even, your Tolarian Terror, if they tap their mana, then pay the ward, and then you Shore Up, it just feels like, there's not much they can do. This type of card also, seeing enough play, which it does, it really does make the slower removal just super painful. Gias Firenado, when they Shore Up, you're just like, oh my God, like feels like you just lost the game right there. It's just a 1-for-1, but the tempo loss is just stunningly bad.
Yeah, this is the kind of card that leads to some pretty sick blowouts where you think you're going to kill, take something important off the board. The best is when your opponent casts it and then pays for your ward on your Tolarian Terror, and then you're just like, because decks that play Tolarian Terror really want Shore Up either before or after the Terror. It's fine either way.
That's right. The other one that comes up that's particularly painful is Tolarian Geyser. You're like, oh, I got the kicker. I'm going to get my card. I'm going to gain that. And you just get none of it, right? It's like, oh man, I kind of needed that card.
Are you ready to admit that combat tricks are great in this set?
Yes. Yeah.
These
two in particular are very good. And then the Gaia's Might is maybe the best one. And then the red kicker one is really good too. It sucks. I hate sets where combat tricks are good, but I got to say, I'm glad they are lending a very good balance to some of the archetypes that I think that I like a lot, but that would be too good if these type of cards weren't here. And also if Enlist wasn't a thing, even though Enlist hasn't become like a major player. If you're the Walls deck, Enlist matters to you. Like it actually does. Smash to Dust. This is the 1 in red sorcery. Choose one, destroy an artifact, a creature with defender, or deal 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. People have been randomly main decking one of these, but I don't.
No, I don't think you should.
This to me is the type of card where I think that people see the bar being, I found a target for this, and it should be a little higher than that. It should be like, this did something particularly useful in the game because it's so narrow. Because the times when you don't find a target or it doesn't do anything particularly good, it needs to make up for those, by being a blowout sometimes where like, I mean, it does suck. Like sometimes they hit your, what's it called? The JMD tome with this. And
Joda's Codex.
Yeah, the Codex, right? It's like, man.
I think a good way to look at it is when you cast this card and kill something, did you get a big advantage? And the answer usually is not a huge one because you spent 2 mana to kill something that's probably worth more than 2 mana in general.
Exactly.
But when you don't have a target, the card is terrible.
Right.
So a card, like imagine this same card that cost 3 mana but drew you a card. Mm-hmm. That's a card I would be like, okay, when you cast this, it's just blowout. 3 mana, kill something that probably costs 3 or 4 mana and draw a card, I'm in.
Yep.
But this being either dead or a 1-for-1 means that you're just going to, by putting this card in your deck, you're just accepting that you're putting 0.7 of a card or something in your deck. Or sometimes you have a target, but it's not like a great one. You just have no other ones. You're like, wow, I can kill your Academy Wall, but it doesn't really matter that much.
Right. And people, I think, feel like when they snap off an Academy Wall that wasn't really doing much, well, this was good. And it's like, well, would you have used your air quote real removal spell on that Academy Wall? Because you wouldn't, and you wouldn't have been happy about it if you did. So that's a good way to look at it. Next is a card that, it's funny, Deathbloom Gardener, 2 and a green, 1/1 death touch, taps to add 1 mana of any color. Objectively, just a very solid card, like it does multiple things. It is interesting how domain-centric this set is, where cards like this lose some value because they don't augment your domain, right? They allow you to cast more stuff. They ramp you. They block and trade. There's nothing wrong with this card on the surface, but it doesn't seem to have a great home here. Like, the fact that it doesn't change your domain hurts it quite a bit.
Yeah, I think it's okay. Like, I play that in the domain decks, but it's funny. So like Scout the Wilderness, right? The 3 mana, go get a basic with kicker 1 and a white, make 2 1/1s. That card in most sets would be a lot worse than the Gardener. Yeah. Like you look at those 2 cards, you're like, wow, I'd much rather have the Death Touch 1/1 that does the same thing and fixes all my colors. But in this set, because of exactly what you're talking about, because of the domain aspect, you actually would rather have Scout the Wilderness, and neither of them are that great. They're just like, these are what I do if I don't get, enough Floriferous Vine Walls or, Sprouting Goblin type stuff.
Right. And it's interesting too, because, we have, this card is, in my opinion, even being buoyed by the fact that it has Death Touch, which is actually quite good in this set. Like, think of a lot of the commons that kill you, Tolarian Terrors and stuff. And, the Gardener is like, come at me, right? Like, I've already cast a couple of spells and now I'm ready to trade off. And even then it's still, fringe playable. Battle Rage Blessing. This is the 1 in a black instant. Target creature gains Death Touch and indestructible. No, this card has not lived up for me.
No, I think it's okay, but I don't think it's a card you want to prioritize. And the main thing that's keeping me from playing Battle Rage Blessing that often is I don't end up with a base black deck with lots of creatures all that often. But I do think it's playable in like the black-white decks, because those decks tend to have a bunch of small creatures, and this is the kind of combat trick that can, just make one of your small things just eat one of their big things, like a Territorial Morrow or something along those lines.
Yeah, so that's probably a good spot for it. Destroy Evil. This one's really shot up the power rankings. This is the 1 in a white instant. Choose one, destroy target creature with power 4 or greater, or destroy target enchantment. Why is this one shining so brightly in this set?
It costs 2 mana is a big part of it. That's not the only part, but a big part is that this just costs 2 mana, which means you're getting a pretty dramatic mana advantage when it works, and that 4 toughness is just a pretty common number to hit. Like, the domain decks all have tons of targets. The blue decks, I think the big part of it is blue decks in most formats wouldn't have a good target, but because of Tolarian Terror, you do. And sometimes because of like Academy Wall is like a fine option if you can't. Like, the only color that really dodges this is white, and even then you have Argivian Phalanx. So like it's the cycle of the cost reducers, I think, goes a long way here.
Yeah. And just being hard removal enough often, and then when you do add when you nab an enchantment, it's actually very real. There's some stuff that you can set up too, where, like you said, like you hit an arrest or something like that, and the thing jumps back in during combat, and all of a sudden it's a blowout. Crystal Grotto is our land that we got here. That's the one that ETBs and Scry won. Taps for colorless, and you can filter 1 mana through it for any color. I will play one of these in my multicolored decks. I would much prefer not to in general, but I have found myself being like, yeah, sure. We'll throw a Grotto in here, and it's felt okay. The Scry one goes a long way also, like, to help you find the other colors that you need.
Yeah, I've been pretty happy. It's funny because one of the knocks, that we gave the Gardener was it doesn't help your domain, and neither does the Grotto. But it does work pretty well with off-color kicker stuff. Yeah. Where, like your blue-black deck that had a Grotto in it and could just use it to play Tolarian Geyser or Repossession. Like, that's just some pretty good value. So it is end up working out pretty well, I think.
Our uncommons, first one up is Tori Davenant Fury Rider. This is the 1 red, white, 3/3 vigilance trample human knight. And whenever it attacks all other attacking creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Other red attacking creatures get trample, and white ones get untapped. I have yet to actually play this card.
It's a strong card if you're red-white aggro. Like, it's a very... The way that the like ABB cycle of, this costs double color of one color of the other, the way those work is they're generally aimed at the 2-color pair they're in and no one else, with some exceptions, like Domain likes Tatiova, for example. But for the most part, they're just not that splashable, and red-white aggro is going to be happy playing this, and absolutely no one else is. But It's a good card in red-white aggro. It's so color intense that I wouldn't want to start it, like pick one it, because you can pick a gold card in this set and actually be pretty happy with that, because you can go a lot of different directions and still have it be good, but not an aggro-focused card that costs red, white. That's not the way to go.
And people don't splash for this card. You don't see like black, red, and then they're just like, oh, I'll just, oops, I got a Tori down. I don't see that happening. I wonder why that is, because it looks powerful.
Yeah, I think it's just because this card really wants to hit on curve, and playing it late is just not going to be quite as effective.
That makes sense. Slimefoot Survey. We hated this card in the set review. This is the 4 and a green sorcery with domain. Search your library for up to 2 land cards. that each have a basic land type, put them on the battlefield tapped and then shuffle. And then you look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. You put up to one of them on top of your library and the rest on the bottom in a random order.
We need a new word for that keyword. Cause
for domain?
No, because there's Scry, right? And Scry 1 plays really well, but they found that Scry like 3+ does not play well.
Oh.
So I think that what we want is like Survey or Scout or something along those lines. Because like, you have like the Scavenger, Voda's Scavenger in this set, and then back in Theros Thassa's Oracle, they're like, look at the top X card, keep one and put it on top, or put them all at the bottom.
Right.
And that plays really well. Well, like Scry 6 is a nightmare, right? Because you're looking at 6 and trying to put them in different places, and you could keep up to 6, but you don't need to. But look at 6, choose the best one, pretty easy. So
right. That makes sense. Yeah, there's the blue-green flyer does that too, right?
Right.
Survey. I kind of like that. This is Slimefoot Survey, so. Yeah,
there we go. So I think this card also has not played out well. No. Like it's not good. Like basically, if you want this effect, go for the Gilded Lotus or the Timeless Lotus, and just go big. Just double your mana.
Right.
Don't do this to get two extra lands.
Although I will say, big time achievement unlocked if you cast this off of the Lotus. Like,
there we go.
You're playing one way. Last uncommon is Sprouting Goblin. This is 1 in a red for a 2/2 Goblin Druid with kicker for green. And when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, search your library for a land card with a basic land type, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And you can pay red, tap, and sacrifice a land to draw a card as well.
I mean, Sprouting Goblin's great.
Yeah.
I'm very, very happy with this card. This is my pick so far in the pack. But, I mean, it's a good card for Domain. It's it's pretty close with Destroy Evil, which is not what I would have guessed at the start of the format, because Destroy Evil looked like, decent but not great. Destroy Evil is fantastic, so I don't mind starting with Destroy Evil. I would consider starting with the Goblin instead here. But
plus you love red-green.
Well, yes, I drafted it in the showdown, I suppose.
That was a cool deck you had.
No, it was cool. Guy's Might was really good there. I had some really good Guy's Might games. But I think the rare here is going to trivialize the rest of the pack, because our rare is the Cruelty of Gix for 3 black. It's a saga that you can start on any chapter. It's got read ahead. And the first chapter is target opponent reveals their hand. You can choose a creature or planeswalker and make them discard it. The second chapter is search your library for any card, put it in your hand. You lose 3 life. And note, that's not an optional thing. So if you started at the first or second chapter, you are losing 3 life. And then the third mode is like the real payoff, which is put any creature or planeswalker from any graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Oh, sorry, just creatures, not planeswalkers. But it puts any creature from the graveyard on the battlefield under your control. So if you play this when you're not under a ton of pressure, you get to make them discard their best creature, search your library for your best card, and then put a creature into play, which there's at least one because you made them discard one.
This is easy front runner for Grown Test. Like, this card is just an absolute thrashing when it hits the battlefield. It's so annoying.
It's just unbelievably good. Yeah,
it is. It's just the grind fest. And I mean, I've seen people pull out victories after having resolved this that didn't look possible. They took the card away that was going to kill them, then got the card out of their library that was going to save them, and then completely took over with whatever the best card in the graveyard was. Yeah, I'm definitely taking Cruelty of Gix here. I wish I opened it more often. All right. Well, that ended up being an easy pick. Let's do another Crack-a-Pack, though.
Let's do it.
And
I do want to make you plant your flag, though. Would you pick pack one Sprouting Goblin or Destroy Evil?
I would do Sprouting Goblin.
Okay, I would too, but I think it's actually pretty close.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I feel like if you don't come away with a 2-for-1, out of your first few picks, you're like behind, or you need to be really aggressive. And I guess that the Destroy Evil, is fine enough in an aggressive deck that, it's a tempo play, something that I could be okay with. But like, man, I'm feeling nervous. We got a 3-for-1 out of our first pack, like straight away.
They can't all be Cruelties of Gix. But Destroy Evil, when you look at the fact that you can pick up like Tolarian Geyser, which feels like a 1.5-for-1, you've got a lot of really, the Urborg Repossessions and Phyrexian Rager type cards.
Right. See, now you're talking
There's a lot of
about
ways
business.
to get advantage.
True. All right, let's get into this next pack. First card out is Timely Interference. We're going to talk about that one in a bit. It's blue for an instant, and it says target creature gets -1/-0 until end of turn. You can kick it for 1 and a red, and if you do, then that creature has to block this turn of Fable. And no matter what happens, you get to draw a card as well. So on its baseline, it says blue, draw a card. And it's funny because a lot of times people talk as if that were good enough in a set. And then if it does other things, then they're like, sure, I'll just take it. And that's usually not true. Usually you can't actually afford to put cards in that just sort of cycle themselves and that's it. But in this set, you can. There are multiple archetypes that care about this, and Timely Interference as blue draw card is totally fine. And then anytime you can leverage it to, say, win a combat or even eat a creature on the other side, it feels like you're getting away with something.
Yeah, I really like the card. I mean, we were pretty high on it from the beginning, and it's held up well.
It has, yeah. Next is Shadow Prophecy. That's one that's gone up the rankings, as you talked about last week. 2 and a black for an instant. And it says, domain, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. Put up to 2 of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard, which can be interesting. And then you lose 2 life. But this is an alternate divination that gives you a lot more card selection in some decks, really powerful card selection in the domain deck, for example, at instant speed as well, which can be relevant. The downside, of course, is losing 2 life is a real cost to pay here as well.
Come on, it's dig through time, not divination.
Right, dig through time. Right. I keep forgetting. It does feel a little bit like that sometimes, doesn't it? I mean, if you get to look at 5 cards, it's not that far off.
Yeah, I'd be lying if I've said I've never decked myself because of this card. But
I also decked myself. Oh, the graveyard, huh? The first few times I played it.
Yeah, but it's a great card. I would hope not to pick one it exactly, but it's a card I'm very happy to be put in my deck. Like I actively want like 1 or 2 in most of my decks.
Mm-hmm. This next card I love. It's Phyrexian Rager. It's an old school cube staple, but it's 2 and a black for a 2/2. And ATBs, you draw a card and lose a life. I will play almost as many of these as I can get. They've been excellent for me.
No complaints about Phyrexian Rager. I mean, I would start by taking it over Shadow Prophecy for sure.
And by the way, 2 of our first 3 cards are 2-for-1s already. Like they're just everywhere. Next card, by the way, is also a 2-for-1. It's Vineshaper Prodigy. That's the 1 and a green 2/2 with kicker for 1 and a blue. And when it ETBs, if it was kicked, look at the top 3 cards of your library and put 1 of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom in any order. Oh, in any order? They didn't do random on that? I didn't notice that. Kind
of weird, but okay.
Yeah. So Vineshaper Prodigy, I actually had higher hopes for it. Like I sort of tongue in cheek called it Organ Hoarder, when we did the set review. But I kind of was hoping that it would play closer to that. And it hasn't really. It's fine. You can definitely put it into your deck, but like you really don't want to play 1 and a green 2/2. Like that's a bit of a disaster for you. So it really does play like a 4-drop. That's pretty good.
Yeah, I think it's actually done fairly well for itself. Like I'm not going to say it's the best card, but I think it plays out pretty well.
Yeah, it's just I don't know. There's something just a little bit missing of the speed of it or something. Next is not a 2-for-1. It's Thrill of Possibility. This is the 1 and a red instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you discard a card and you draw 2 cards. I'm going to bring this card up again when we talk about the blue-red deck in just a few minutes here, Luis, and I'm going to get your take on it then. So we'll just set it aside for now. We're not going to be first picking it in any case. Shore Up. Okay. There's Tribute to Urborg. This is a nice pack. That's the 1 and a black. Target creature gets -2/-2. You can kick it for 1 and a blue, and it gets an additional -1/-1 for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. Basically, it scales perfectly with the game. If you end up playing it on the first 2 to 3 turns, it'll kill an early threat as just -2/-2. And then if you get the mana together and you can pay 4, it in the decks that it does well in, it'll usually kill anything.
Yeah, I mean it's a solid removal spell, and you don't even really need the kicker part for it to be a playable, but you really do want to have access to it eventually.
Right. Like I played 4 of them in the showdown deck and I was blue-black. If I did not have access to blue mana, I would probably have played 2 of them. Like I don't want
That's exactly
4
the number I was going to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Next is, boy, this guy looked bad and is bad. This is Llanowar Stalker. This is the green 1/1, and whenever another creature ETBs under your control, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. This is a potential, my opponent played this and now I have to win or quit Magic forever card. Like, it has been really bad.
Yeah, this card's horrendous. Like, I don't think I've ever lost to it, and I hope that I never do.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. What about Argivian Phalanx? That one's been pretty good.
Yeah, it's pretty solid. The 5 and a white 4/4 that costs 1 less for every creature you have, and has vigilance too. It's just a card that in the white decks that go wide, or even just the white decks that are like an aggro deck with lots of creatures, kind of the way to look at these cost reducers is how much of a cost reduction do you need before you feel like you got a decent deal? As it turns out, the answer for this one is if it costs 4 mana, you're doing all right. And if at 3 or less mana, you're feeling really good about it.
Right.
And not that hard to end up doing that. So it's a card that fits very nicely into any creature-heavy deck. I'm not one to want to first pick this. I would probably still take Phyrexian Rager of all the cards we've seen so far. I like Rager over Tribute early. But Argivian Phalanx is, one of the cards I would expect in this pack that we've seen so far to go, 4th or something along those lines.
Yeah, it's not uncommon for a curve out to be random 2-drop on turn 2, and then turn 3 you play Argivian Cavalier, so that gives you 3 creatures, and then on turn 4 you have 4 mana plus the 3 creatures, so you're actually clear of it. So even if one of your creatures has died, or if you have a 1-drop or something, that you can kind of double up with Phalanx, and it's powerful at that stage of the game for sure. It definitely feels like it allows you to do a few double spell turns at some point in the mid game where you're like, dang, like you just added a lot of power to the board. Last comment is Meteorite. Poor sad Meteorite. 5 mana for an artifact. When it ETBs, it does 2 damage to any target, and it taps for any color of mana. It's a
playable if you're short. If you have a powerful 5-color deck and you don't quite have enough fixing. The fact that it kills something when it ETBs is good. Mm-hmm. Makes it justifiable, but it's not a great card.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say it's a playable if you're short on intellectual ability, perhaps.
No, I've played the card, and I think I think that about I don't have too many issues in that area.
Well, I don't know. I used to think that, but now you're playing Meteorites. No, you're right. It does do the thing, but it really does suffer from what we talked about before, where it doesn't affect your domain, even with the mana fixing. The ramp at 5 is a little bit clunky as well, but there's enough kicker to make it so you can pay for something. It really comes down to go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, or just if you can play it and then play a 1 or 2 mana removal spell in the same turn.
Mm-hmm. Because to me, the question is, does Meteorite kill something of relevance? And that's hit or miss. If it does, then you're good to go. All right, uncommons. First one up, really fun one. Wrath, Weatherlight Stalwart. This is the blue-white 1/3 that I always think has flying and doesn't. It's a legend, and it says, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you may tap 2 untapped creatures you control, and if you do, you draw a card, and you can pay 3 white to give creatures you control +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. Really great card, super sweet.
Yeah, Wrath is the reason one of the big reasons I end up drafting blue-white fairly often. Actually, it's been one of my most winning decks, and you just get to draw a bunch of extra cards, and then late in the game you start activating it and just smashing for lots of damage. So it's a really good card. I would certainly pick it over any of the commons that we've seen so far. This is, I think, by far the best card, even as a gold card.
Definitely. I'm here. My second place finisher is Phyrexian Rager, and third is Tribute to Urborg at this point. That's kind of where I'm at. Next card up is Yosha Declares War, which I think Tupperware played this against me.
It is the kind of card I expect to see, faced in the showdown and never again in the format.
Right. But, this is a team draft.
If you've got a lot of artifacts, then you can trick yourself into playing it. But
what if you have one?
Well, it's got Karn. It is good, strong, but it is playable with Karn.
Yeah. Okay. It's 1 in a red for Saga.
Clear, that's if you draw Karn. Not playable in a deck with Karn. It's playable if you draw Karn every game.
Is that how Magic works? This is it's a read-ahead Saga for 1 in a red. You get an O2 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying called Ornithopter. Chapter 2 is tap any number of untapped artifacts you control to do 1 damage to target creature or planeswalker. And chapter 3 is up to 1 target artifact you control becomes a creature with base power and toughness 4/4 until end of turn. And this, this is team draft, so it's a different scenario. But when this was played against me, I had the option to kill the Thopter and just didn't.
Okay, so by itself, you play this, you get an O2. Next turn, that O2 pings something for 1, and then after that you get to attack for 4 with it. So if you kill an X1, I guess it's playable, but a lot has to go right for all that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it did stop. Like I had no 2-drop that I wanted to play that turn, and I drew the Raven Man. And then I'm like, oh, sweet. And I'm like, oh, man, like I'm actually going to give this to. So it's stuck in my hand until the next turn. Choking Miasma is next. This is a 1 black sorcery at uncommon with kicker for green. If this spell was kicked, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control or on a creature you control. And it gives all creatures -2/-2 until end of turn.
This is a sideboard card. You can main deck it if you've got a control deck that has access to a lot of black mana and doesn't really get miasma'd much. Mm-hmm. But honestly, you should probably just grab this to sideboard in if you want it. You're not a card I would be thrilled to main deck generally.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. And if it does hit you, it feels like kind of bad. Oh my God. I haven't opened this yet. Like literally don't have one. I don't think in my whole collection. Ether Channelers are rare. 2 and a blue for a 2/1 human wizard at rare. When Ether Channeler enters the battlefield, choose 1. Create a 1/1 bird creature token with flying, or return another target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, or draw a card. Such a sweet card. Like this is almost a hard lock for my favorite card of the set, and it's like I never get to play it.
Yeah, the funny thing about this card is no individual mode is going to end up being completely ridiculous, but the fact that you get access to any of the ones you want means the card is never bad. There's no situation where this card isn't good.
Exactly.
And I do think Ether Channeler beats Raft. It's monocolor. It's slightly better, I think, overall, and doesn't really require anything of you besides you can cast this. You splash it in Domain, play it in blue-red, play it in blue-white or blue-black or whatever color combination you end up. So, yeah, I mean, Ether Channeler is the business.
It's funny having it in the same pack with Phyrexian Rager. The Rager's like, really, bro? Like, you can make flyers or bounce stuff, or you could just be me with no life loss. Like
that is the funny thing, because Phyrexian Rager and Ether Channeler, when you draw a card, are about the same card. Yeah. But the fact is, sometimes you make a 1/1 flyer because they have a 2/1 flyer in play. Sometimes, you need to bounce something. Like you end up in a much better position because of all the options here.
Yeah. All right. So there's our Crack-a-Packs. We took the rare both times. So there you go. That's the limited resources way. Draft the hard way. Just take the rare every time. Okay. Let's get into a few of the non-domain decks here. And you had something about covering these 2-color decks?
Yeah, so what we're going to talk about today is blue-red, blue-white, and black-white. And one of the advantages of playing these decks is that, unlike the domain deck, you don't actually need to take lands that highly. That's not to say that you never end up splashing in these decks. Sometimes, like I had a blue-white deck that splashed the kicker on 2 Ruinous Vortexes and a Phyrexian Missionary, so I was like, I'll play a Swamp, that sort of thing. But you don't have to prioritize lands, and that ends up opening up picks, because sometimes in your domain, you're like, oh, I'm going to third pick this land. Well, when you are in one of these decks, you just don't have to do that.
Right. So I'll start off with the blue-red spells deck. It's definitely one of the more popular decks to draft. It's one of the more straightforward ones. And for me, and Luis, I am definitely curious to see if your experience is different from any of this. But for me, I think about it in terms of 2 versions of the deck that you can get, and they can overlap. But for one of them is like the Tolarian Terror version, and the other one is the Gitu Amplifier version. And I'm just using these cards as kind of the figureheads for the 2 different styles that you can play. These cards can go into both versions, don't
right?
They're not
you're clearly going to play Tolarian Terror in both. And the Amplifier I found to be mostly weak in the controlling version, but it has a lot more gas. And I do want to clarify something as before we go into this. When we talked last week, we talked about how we had mostly been drafting the blue-red deck as a controlling version. That's not to say there isn't a good aggro version available as well. So
exactly. And I wanted to cover that in here too, just, because I have dabbled in that. And I do think the more controlling one is a little bit better. It's a little more consistent. I would guess that it has slightly higher win rate, but there's some real punch to the other version. So both decks care about one thing in common, which is spells being cast, right? And so that means, and by spells, I mean instant and sorceries. So cantrips are the name of the game. Cards that replace themselves, that's the shorthand is cantrip for those. So cards like Impulse, Joint Exploration, Phyrexian Espionage even, Timely Interference that we talked about before, Fires of Victory, and Tolarian Geyser are all heavily played. Like people will just basically play about as many of these as they can get, because as long as it doesn't cost too much, and it replaces itself, or if it costs a little bit more, if it affects the board and replaces itself, you're good to go. Like all of these cards are right where you want to be for that type of stuff. For the Tolarian Terror version, the more controlling version of the deck, these of course make the terrors cheaper, but they also dig you through your library to find the correct answers for the right threats that you're facing down on the other side to keep yourself alive so that those Tolarian Terrors can finish the game for you. For the aggressive Amplifier version, these spells trigger cards like the Amplifier, Balmor Battle Mage Captain, and Electrostatic Infantry, which are kind of the golden trio. There's rares. These are all, I'm only pulling from the commons and uncommons. There are, of course, rares that really turbocharge these strategies as well. But for the cards that you see draft in and draft out, those are the ones that, get triggered by instants and sorceries and can lay on a heck of a lot of damage in a really short period of time. You can also get a lot of cheap interaction that are instants and sorceries that, we'll probably see play anyway. And you just get to leverage the fact that they're instants and sorceries, cheap and effective cards like Lightning Strike, Essence Scatter, and Flowstone Infusion are kind of the three that you see the most often because they're just all solid. It's basically like Lightning Bolt, Shock, and Counterspell, right? They're just different versions of those for limited, and they do a really, really good job. But even cards like Rona's Vortex, Impede Momentum in the aggressive version, and Shore Up all play similar roles where these type of cards have a meaningful impact on the game, and they're very cheap, and they are instants or sorceries, and that fills a niche there that does the same stuff that we talked about before with getting your pump creatures pumped up or making it cheaper for you to have a multiple spell turn with Tolarian Terror or even multiple of them. One question I had, and I brought this up in the Crack-A-Packet that I wanted to call back to, was Thrill of Possibility. I don't play it in these decks. I don't prioritize it. I haven't felt the need to run it. I don't think I would feel bad if I had to, but I never end up running it, even though it seems like it would really fit into these strategies quite well for the kind of cantrip version that I said, where you're even on cards, but you've cast a spell and seen some more. Am I just overlooking Thrill, or is it not that important?
No, Thrill's fine. I'm surprised you haven't played it. You play Impulse, right?
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah, Impulse is great. I think it's better than Thrill, but I think Thrill is just a fine card to play.
Okay.
What's nice about Thrill is when you cantrip a bunch, sometimes when you cycle a bunch, when you trade one for one a bunch, you end up maybe with extra lands over the course of the game. Yeah. And Thrill can let you cycle through those. The other thing Thrill can do is you can discard a spell to it, and so it actually puts two spells in your graveyard, which can be nice too. Yeah. But if you look at Timely Interference, Impulse, Tolarian Geyser, Thrill's worse than all of those cards. So
Joint Exploration, Espionage. Would you play a Thrill over an Espionage?
In a straight blue-red deck, I think Thrill's better than Espionage most of the time.
So that's kind of the dividing line there. I think I'm probably prioritizing the Espionage a little too highly there, than that, which makes sense.
Yeah.
Jaya's Fire NATO is another one that I don't play anymore. I do think
because that card's crap.
Right. I think it's just one of those cards that in a normal set would be like a D, right? Where you put it in your deck sometimes, but you kind of hope not to. Maybe you run one, ideally zero, that type of thing. But here, man, you really need the cheap stuff. You need to be kind of churning through your library. You need to be filling up your yard. And if you end up having to run a Fire NATO, it's a real bummer. As far as finishing the game goes, For the Tolarian Terror version, usually what my game plan, again, this is a more controlling version, has been to keep the threats off the board with Lightning Strike, Essence Scatter, Tolarian Geyser, Flowstone Infusion, right? And then I will usually end up seeing enough cards and getting enough instants and sorceries in my graveyard that I can have a turn where I can play 1 or even 2 copies of Tolarian Terror and even still have mana up to do something else. And that's kind of the big finish, right? Like that, it's like Essence Scatter your 2-drop. They play something, okay, Lightning Strike it, or Flowstone Infusion it. They play something, you play a tap land, and then Tolarian Geyser their thing, right? So you're sort of just like keeping parity. You're 1 for 1, 1 for 1, bounce your thing, but I get a card back. And then all of a sudden you're like, terror, and I have an Essence Scatter up or something like that. And that's the, or as we talked about before, maybe you have a way to protect it, right? You have Shore Up in your hand with the terror or something like that. And then the tide has turned, right? Because the terror is a very difficult card to get off the battlefield, and it's usually bigger than everything else on the other side at that point.
Yeah. And one thing I want to kind of mention too, when you look at the 2 different decks here, they're not different by that many cards. If you took the blue-red control deck and you cut the 4 worst cards or four spells out of it, and you put in 4 creatures, it could be the blue-red aggro deck. Like a big difference, and this is partly why I draft the control deck more. Is it's hard to cut spells for creatures in a deck that wants lots of spells. Mm-hmm. So I think the approach I would prefer is to try to kill them with a couple big creatures or high-impact creatures like Balmor and Tolarian Terror, than to have stuff like Flowstone Kavu in your deck.
Right. And that's really cuts to the core of how these games end, because for the aggressive, or however the tempo version, the amplifier version, if you will, you do have access to these extremely explosive finishes, especially if you can get Balmor on the battlefield. The way that I treat Balmor is more of an endgame finisher, like a combo card, rather than like run it out on turn 2, and if it dies, who cares type card. Like I will, if possible, I will wait with it in my hand and try to have a way to protect it. Because if you get any board presence going at all, like I've had this happen a lot of times where I have Balmor, like an amplifier, right? Just a random amplifier that maybe I bounced something with a while ago. And then like use like the 2/3 menace guy, or just some random common creature. It doesn't have to be anything good at all. You can like cast 2 spells, and you are all of a sudden attacking for a huge amount of damage, especially, I don't remember the name of it, but what's the 2 in a red mass pump spell that you can with the kicker for black? Like that card's just completely stupid with these decks. Like it adds such an absolutely asinine amount of damage. But again, Balmor is really the key because of pumping your whole team and because of giving trample. That really changes the combat math in such a significant way. And usually when you make these attacks, you can do so without your opponent having any clue what's coming. Like if you've got 1, 2, or God forbid 3 spells in your hand with this board that I just set up, you're just like attack with everything. And you're like, I don't care how you block, right? I just cast a thing. And if one of them's a removal spell, if one of them's a bounce spell, like it just completely floods the opponent with damage. And that's how that can go. The reason that I prefer the more controlling deck goes back to what Luis said just a little bit ago, is that Tolarian Terror and friends are those are very difficult cards to kill, and you can really craft a game plan around making sure that you get them down kind of after your opponent's out of resources or when you can protect those cards. But if you want to go for the more aggressive, assertive version that's trying to kind of flood your opponent with damage, like I said, you have to run your Balmor out there on 2. You sometimes just have to play your amplifier on turn 2. And the problem is that if your opponent understands how this matchup works, they just kill it. They don't wait. They don't get cute. They don't do it. They're just like, I'll use any removal spell that I possibly can, and I will take that off the board, because once I do, I know you're sitting there with 3 impulses in your hand, or versions of impulse, or reactionary cards or something, and you have no pressure on me, and I can just take my time to build up a bigger board and take advantage. Where when you play the controlling version, and you end up with all the Tolarian Terrors on the board, that's not a game plan that's an option for your opponent. That's why I prefer it, if given the choice. That said, what Luis said at the very top is absolutely true, which is that there's a huge overlap of cards, and very often you'll have some mix of all of these in your deck, and that's totally fine too. It doesn't have to fit only into one category or the other. And both decks are quite powerful as well.
Yeah, and it's just really fun when you get a deck full of timely interferences, impulses, and essence scatters, and they just drop 2 Tolarian Terrors in the same turn, or
it's so
even
sweet.
one. It's just so sweet.
It's also great if you can get Balmor going with the Tolarian Terrors because they're already so huge, and the trample and all that stuff too. What about blue-white? I haven't drafted this deck that much, so I'm curious to hear what you say about it.
So it's not that different in the sense that blue still kind of is the core of it, at least the versions I typically draft, where you care a lot about essence scatter and Tolarian Geyser and impulse and all the like spells matter stuff. All that stuff is really good for you, but white adds at uncommon Wrath and Tura Kenyaru, the 3/3 that makes a 1/1 whenever you end up casting a spell. And then at common you get to kick Tolarian Geyser, which is pretty nice. You also get to play something like Citizen's Arrest. Destroy Evil is huge. It's a cheap spell that also has a very big effect on the game. Stand Your Ground is good too. And then you emphasize flyers a little bit more. So it's not a control deck. It's actually more of a tempo deck because you do want Soaring Drake and Talus Lookout and Mesa Cavalier a little bit more than you would in like the blue-red deck that's mostly Tolarian Terror trying to finish. And it's also got besides like the fact that white gives you Destroy Evil and Citizen's Arrest, you also get another excellent way to kind of tap their creatures down with Stall for Time, and then a bunch of decent uncommons. So Stall for Time, of course, fits really nicely, right? It's a cantrip that taps their things down sometimes for multiple turns. So you end up being pretty happy with that. And I've liked the blue-white deck a lot. Wrath is the biggest reason to go blue-white, and it's an uncommon, which means you're not always gonna end up there. But when you do get a Wrath, then it actually goes a long way because whenever you play a spell, tap 2 creatures to draw a card, you just get to have Wrath plus another creature out, and then you just set up the situation where every spell you play draws you a card, and it's not hard to win from there.
Yeah, and the fact that Summoning Sickness doesn't play into that's a key thing too. Like I can't tell you how many times I've played Wrath plus a spell in that turn to guarantee that I get the card back even if they untap and kill Wrath.
Yeah, so you can play this like a control deck if you're drawing enough cards. Obviously, that's always an option where you're like, Essence Scatter your thing, Citizen's Arrest your thing, cast Impulse, draw a card off Wrath, whatever. But I really like it when you just like play a creature or two, and then you Tolarian Geyser their thing, and then you Essence Scatter when it comes back down, then you cast Stall for Time. And what I really like with this deck is playing against the Domain deck where they're like, I'm going to start on turn 4 or 5 playing these like big spells, Maria's Outrider, Territorial Mara, whatever, and you're just like spending 2 mana, 3 mana to answer their 5 mana play every turn, and it gets pretty demoralizing pretty fast, I think, for them.
Yeah. You do consider this more towards the controlling end because you said tempo. Like, where does it fall on average for you?
I think it's a little more on the tempo side because cards like Stall for Time and Tolarian Geyser and even Essence Scatter are better if you're attacking them. So having cards like Soaring Drake and Talus Lookout and Mesa Cavalier, I don't like Griffin Protector all that much because it costs a little bit more mana. When you have those cards, you're generally pretty happy with like. Anytime a bounce spell represents dealing an extra 4 damage to them, that's really good for you.
It adds up really fast. One thing I think we should contextualize these decks that we're talking about here too, because I think it's one of the reasons that I like blue-red, and maybe is true of this, is how is this matchup against like the more popular decks like Domain?
I like the matchup against Domain a lot. I mean, you just have these 2 mana counters, 3 mana bounce spells that line up really nicely against their, powerful 5 mana plays, and you can actually go, toe to toe with them in terms of card advantage if you end up getting enough value out of your cards. Blue-white does suffer a little against a low curve aggro deck because those same strategies aren't as effective. Like Tolarian Geysering a 2-drop isn't great, Right. So you Stall for Time when you're behind on board is not fantastic, but if you get a Tura Kenyaru down and you're getting a token every time you cast a spell, yeah, you can do fine there. Tolarian Terror is still great in this deck and still great against any of the creature-based strategies.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think what we're really discovering here, right, is that there's a lot of really efficient blue commons, right, that are not overpowered. Like they're not the type of card that just dominate a game and everybody throws their hands up and goes, what the heck? They need to have a home. Like they need to be built around a little bit. But when you do, you got some really nice decks, available to you. Black, white. So this is one that's been talked about on Twitter. I think, is it Tupperware that loves it, or I don't know. So people have been saying, that black, white's a really good deck, and I've been drafting it a fair bit myself, and I agree with them. I think it is. It's not, there's nothing fancy about this deck. It has access to a very deep pool of well-rounded commons that lets you have a lot of flexibility in the draft portion to come up with a solid plan. I mean, it's not that much more complicated than that. The removal in the color pair is exceptionally well-rounded as well. Even just at common, you get Citizen's Arrest, Extinguish the Light, and Tribute to Urborg to cover. There's not really any cards in the set that one of those doesn't answer, and those are just the commons, right? And at uncommon, you get the kind of pumped up versions of those like Prayer of Binding, Runic Shot, and Cut Down, the more efficient versions basically. But, you often, I often think about removal of being like early game, late game, or early game, mid game, late game, or something like that. And this just has all of it, right? Tribute to Urborg, even if you can't kick it, just can kill small creatures. Citizen's Arrest can kill anything, and Extinguish the Light can kill anything, right? It's like, wow. And if you just get a random blue, sometimes your Tribute to Urborg can even take out something bigger too. So, and that's only the commons, right, for the removal. So really, really strong suite of removal that kind of acts as the backbone for this stuff. And then it has a fairly consistent tokens sub-theme. I believe it's mostly off the back of the good common Argivian Cavalier, right? That's the 2/2 that brings a 1/1 with it. That's just been a solid performer. It's not, some incredible, but it's solid. And you just end up with these tokens a lot. What were you going to say, Luis?
Oh, just Phyrexian Warhorse also is another way to generate tokens. And then
the big Cavalier.
I kind of count Phyrexian Rager and Battlefly Swarm at common, just putting more creatures on the board, and then as well as the Cult Conscript at uncommon, the 1 mana 2/1 that keeps coming back. Yeah,
that guy keeps coming back, and then there's also there's the 2/1 that the Splatter Goblin, right? That is expendable, we'll say, and these type of cards that leave an extra body around really allow you to take advantage of a pretty wide suite of cards in this color pair, like Argivian Phalanx we mentioned before, just it makes it cheaper, but like Bone Splinters, right? Like that makes that an actual removal spell if you have a bunch of expendable creatures around. Griffin Protector even, right? Like I'm not a huge fan of the card either, but in this deck, it can routinely attack for 4 damage. Like there's a lot of cards that you can cast after it that'll keep it churning in some damage. Cleaving Skyrider, if you can pay the kicker on it, it's red, so you can't always do so. But like even just the basic stuff like Heroic Charge or Aaron Benalia's Ruin, like these type of cards want a lot of bodies on the battlefield, and they pay you off handsomely for doing so. They just do. Like Aaron needs stuff to sack, but also needs stuff to put some counters on, and Heroic Charge is self-explanatory as far as that goes. So this comes up a lot. Like it just sort of, you don't have to focus on getting like token specific cards or cards that particularly care about tokens. But if you end up with Phyrexian Warhorses and Argivian Cavaliers, you now can play a Heroic Charge. You now can play a Bone Splinters or 2. Aaron all of a sudden is like really good in your deck rather than just being like dang good. It's like an ender. So keep that in mind. The games will play out mostly like a mid-range deck, but you're on the more assertive side of things rather than on the more controlling side. You would like to curve out creatures on 2, 3, and 4. Like it's not reactive like we were talking about with blue-red, where you're like trying to like kill and counter stuff on turn 2, 3, and 4. Here, you would actually like to curve out with your creatures if possible. And then you can start using your removal to take out blockers and start applying pressure. The game for me has ended in 2 different scenarios most commonly. One of them is you just have a good draw where you draw a nice curve out with a good backup of removal, and you just kill their blocker, attack them for a bunch, kill their next blocker, attack them for the bunch, and they're just like, okay, I guess you got me. But if that doesn't work, or if you don't have quite the right mix, particularly if you're a little bit heavier on the creature side of thing, but less on the removal, then you'll end up with 5 or 6 creatures pretty routinely, and you can pump them up with one of the cards we talked about with Aaron or Heroic Charge or something like that to finish the game. And then the really cool part is this to me is the most well-rounded deck. It's the most consistent, like 2-color performer where you're like, it has all the bases covered. It doesn't have any strong weaknesses at all, because you might be thinking, well, what if I find myself in like an attrition fight? This is a pretty 2-for-1 heavy set. So if you're planning on 1-for-1 removing their creatures and attacking them with yours, you could easily find yourself in a spot where they play a few 2-for-1 creatures, you burned your removal, and they still have cards and can take over. But the cool part is you can too. You get cards like Phyrexian Missionary, which is the 2/3 lifelink with the 1 and a black kicker that brings a creature back. That card's amazing in this deck. Phyrexian Rager, which we've talked about just being a solid 2-for-1. Urborg Repossession. And even in a pinch, you can play Shadow Prophecy and just use it as a way to generate card advantage. I've even played it when I only had access to black and white mana and just said, okay, this is just going to be my divination and I want one of them in this deck. And so this deck isn't the type of thing that just says, here's my creatures, here's my removal, I'm going to be top decking the rest of the game and I just hope I get there. You actually do have some play, even if the game goes a little bit longer, or even if your opponent, takes out some of your key stuff. So to me, this is sort of a classic mid-range deck, leaning a little bit more towards the aggressive side if you had to choose, and it's just super well-rounded. The commons are rock solid. It has access to good removal, good card advantage, and good creatures, and it plays out like that most of the time too.
Yeah, I like how flexible it can be, where you can grind them out, you can aggro them out, you can look like you're trying to do one and then switch to the other. That's the kind of a hallmark of good decks, is that, and this is kind of why I like blue-white, for example, where it looks like you're playing a tempo game, but then they kill 2 of your early creatures, and you're like, all right, I'll just lean them back on Essence Scatters and Impulses, draw cards off Wrath. Black-white is like, oh, you stop my early aggression. Let me cast some Ragers and a Phyrexian Missionary and an Urborg Repossession and be right back in it. Or you think we're both sitting here drawing cards, and then I hit you with a heroic charge after casting a couple token makers.
Exactly. And that middle scenario that you described, I have done that numerous times, and it's really impressive. Like, there's been times where like I'll run out the Phyrexian Missionary on 2 and then the Rager on 3, and I'm just trying to attack with them, maybe take advantage of a combat trick like the really good one that we mentioned that I'm spacing on the name on. What is it called? +1/+1 lifelink indestructible. Stand your ground. Take up the shield.
Take up the shield. Sorry,
I
think I called the stand your ground earlier.
Yeah, so like I'll just be like, attack with both of these. They block. They want to trade. Okay, take up the shield, and then they pick off the 2/3 lifelinker. I trade off the Phyrexian Rager, and then I'm like, Urborg Repossession for the 2/3 lifelink. Play it with kicker. Get back the Rager. Play that, and it's like I've got 2 cards in my hand, and my board is back in play, and the opponent has to be looking at it like, dang, I had that board down to nothing. I thought I had stabilized, and now here he is back with the creatures again, and he's got more cards in hand as well. And that's just a very flexible approach to the game. So I would say if you're struggling with this format, if you're kind of like, I just don't really get the blue-red deck, or the domain deck's too overwhelming, or it never comes together right for me, I'm having a hard time getting the lands or the balance right for it, try drafting this black-white deck if it's in front of you, because this is a very bread and butter limited deck that's right down the center, right? It gives you flexibility in game plan. It gives you all the tools you need at your disposal. And it just sort of says, draft me well. Right? Like, get a good balance of creatures, removal spells, a few ways to get some cards back into the game, and put together some type of game plan while you're actually playing the game itself, and you'll be good to go. So I like the deck a lot. And I do think that it has a deep enough card pool of black and white commons to make it a staple in the format. Before we take off, Luis, I did want to mention the format's really good. Like,
yeah.
They kind of got a really nice one here. Like, you notice that we haven't been talking about color imbalances?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because Domain takes up a lot of the space in the format. Mm-hmm. But one of the cool things, and this was true of Kaldheim too. Remember, we liked Kaldheim, right? Mm-hmm. We both drafted a lot of Kaldheim. Mm-hmm. When Domain is one of the biggest decks in the format, I think that is not like when, Blue-red is one of the biggest decks in the format, because Blue-red is a deck that here, actually a better example. Remember Innistrad Midnight Hunt, Blue-black was a big part of the format. Mm-hmm. Turned out we liked Blue-black because it's pretty fun to play, but it did, I think, detract from the format that Blue-black was so good. like it took up too much of the space. Domain, both here and in Kaldheim with the 5-color snow decks, can feel really different. Like base blue Domain with Impulse and Essence Scatter feels different than base green Domain with a lot of fixing, or base black Domain with Phyrexian Rager and Shadow Prophecy and Extinguish the Light. And you get to play such a wide range of cards that you could tell me, hey, you know what? If someone just waved a magic wand and said, your next 5 Dominaria drafts, you're going to draft Domain 5 times, I'd be like, great. That sounds fun.
Yeah.
I bet I'll have a good time.
Totally. And you won't know exactly what those decks will look like.
Exactly. And if someone said, hey, look at this other draft format, you're going to draft black-white 5 times, I would be like, that doesn't sound that fun.
Right.
I bet by the 3rd time, I'm like, you're just the same pool of cards over and over again. It's not going to feel that different. So that, and the fact that there's a bunch of color pairs which are good, blue-red, blue-white, black-white, the red-green. Like I basically drafted red-green in the showdown, and that's not the first time I've done that. It can be pretty fun. And there's a lot of different color pairs that are good, plus Domain being good, plus the cards being fun, I think has led to overall, I would say, I don't want to spoil the Sunset Show. We're very far away from there, but it's going to get a high grade. It's going to get an A. Whether it's an A minus, or an A, probably not an A plus, but it's going to get an A or A minus, I would bet. And at this point, we're enough weeks into the format, enough drafts in to know that this is going to be one of the good ones.
Definitely. When it comes to the Domain deck, I'm really impressed by the ability of the designers to make it worth drafting that deck without being overpowered, right? Because sometimes we've had these type of decks where if you get there, it's stupid, right? There's some dumb common that it's like, yeah, you just get an 8/8 for 4 mana or something, and like nobody else has access to that. And if you don't get there, then you don't get it at all, right? And I hate that because it just makes it like, I don't like it. I like it when strategies or types of cards within strategies can be progressive, where it's like these want like Morrow or something like that in this deck, where it's like, hey, you get a pretty good deal. And then sometimes it's a 10/10 for 5, and that's pretty cool too. Where a lot of times it feels like these ones are like, if you get all the colors, then you get to completely go off. And if you fall even a little bit short of that, you don't at all. And I don't think that's fun for anybody. This is really nice. Like you can play the Root Walla, right? It's one of the actual pretty decent payoffs for that deck. And you don't have to have literally all 5 basic land types represented to make that card good. You can have 4. 3 is like borderline, but 4 is like good enough. And to me, there's all the cards sort of reflect that, where it's like there is, 3 is okay, 4 is good, 5 is excellent. And that's totally fine. Really well done for them to stick the landing on that and not fall for the trap of saying, well, hey, if the person's going to put together all 5 colors, then we have to really give them this great card that's the payoff. Instead, everything kind of scaled. Maybe it's a testament to how good Domain is as a mechanic as well. Okay, let's call it a show there. Hopefully you're having fun with the format like we are, and we've given you some ideas on what you might want to draft if you haven't tried out some of these archetypes before. I definitely recommend them. They're fun and powerful. Blue-red on the control end is going to be one of my favorite decks in the format. By the end of it, I know it. So there you go. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. You can find everything related to the podcast over at lrcast.com. I want to thank our sponsors, channelfireball.com and FTX for their continued sponsorship of the show. We do appreciate it. And that's going to do it for this one. We'll be back with more Dominaria United next week.
All right. So I've put together, inspired by a meme I saw, a good list here. All right. So first I'll explain the meme I saw because I thought it was great. It had the U.S., and if you're not from the U.S., this is going to be maybe not hit quite the same, but it had the U.S. divided into 4 quadrants, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got the Northwest. So we're talking Northern California and above, like, Washington. The people there act nice and are nice.
Yeah.
So, right? I think that's been our experience. And then you have the Northeast. So
wait, and by the way, we're both from that area, right?
Yeah.
NorCal for you and Washington for me.
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
good.
So then you have the Northeast, like the New England and stuff, and it's acts mean is nice. So your typical New Yorker is like really, really gruff and like mind your own business and stuff, but it's actually nice.
Yeah.
Then you have the Southwest. So this is like LA and Southern California. Mm-hmm. Acts mean is mean. And yeah, I've been to LA before.
Hey, well, Paul's from LA, so
There you go.
There you go.
And then you have the Southeast. So this is like the South in Florida. Acts nice, is mean. So
Oh, amazing. That's
right?
too good.
The South, bless your heart, right? Like that's straight up like to your face politeness, definitely not nice.
Right.
So I've extended this to some other categories. Let's look at social media platforms, shall we?
Okay.
First, acts nice, is nice. You have Instagram. Everyone on Instagram is just loving it. Like you go to Instagram, you post a picture, your friends all heart it.
Yep.
Like
You
don't
look
get into
great.
flame wars on Instagram. You have to work hard to get into a fight on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
Acts mean is nice. You've got Discord. Because on Discord, people like they give each other, crap. You can end up in spots, but you think about like the Among Us games we had on Discord. People can be aggro, but like ultimately you're hanging out and having fun.
Yeah.
Acts mean is mean. Twitter is just
Oh yeah.
Everyone on Twitter,
Awful.
like you post the wrong thing, you get buried.
Yeah.
I expect once we get to our last category, Twitter might have some words for me. And then acts nice is mean. Facebook. People pretend to be nice on Facebook. They are not. Like
Right.
that is the place.
That's
right,
really good.
Because I have, like you said, some difficulties in the thinking department, I've decided to extend this to sections of the Magic community. So, in the acts nice is nice category, Magic judges. My experience with Magic judges, they're nice to you when they're judging because they are nice. Magic judges tend to be nice.
Yes.
Acts mean is nice. I'm going to go with former Magic pros. Like,
yes,
if you look at Magic pros, the way they talk to each other can be pretty aggressive. But in my experience, and I know I'm biased. I'm part of this group. They can be pretty nice, especially to people not in their group. When like someone comes up to you, wants to talk to you at an event or whatever, ask you questions, that sort of thing. But we can be pretty savage to each other. Acts mean is mean. Legacy players, come on. Like, have you ever interacted with anyone from the Legacy community?
So brutal.
And let's just say the acts nice is mean, and I will not be explaining this. We'll go with Commander. All right, have a good day, folks.
Whoa.